Morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar this morning. This is Joe Brown with Xagility. Today we're going to be talking about upgrading SharePoint from older versions, unsupported versions, to modern 2019 and online Office 365. I have a co-presenter with me today. We'll introduce each other here in just a second. I got a couple of housekeeping items I want to talk about with everyone. We're going to have Q&A at the end of the webinar today. Please put your Q&A in the chat box on the right-hand side. You can see there in your GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar controls. Also, we're going to have a couple of polling questions this morning to get a little feedback from you, the audience, about what you're doing with SharePoint, where you're at in your upgrade journeys and things of that nature that we can share with each other so that everyone can kind of see where people are and what they're doing these days with SharePoint. I think it'll be really helpful for not only us, but also the folks who are attending on the webinar. So thanks again for spending some time with us this morning. Again, my name is Joe Brown. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer here at Xagility. I previously have done a lot of work in the cloud world. Prior to joining Xagility, I was worldwide cloud strategist for E+, and before that, I had the pleasure of being the president and chief operating officer of Accelera, of which we were very Microsoft centric and won the Azure Public Sector Partner of the Year award a couple of times during my tenure there. And then prior to that, I was at Citrix Systems, which all of you probably know for virtualization and lots of painful end user calls about things not working. But SharePoint, Microsoft technologies are core to what we do here at Xagility. And I want to introduce my colleague here, Deepa Iyer, and have her talk a little bit about her experience.
Thank you, Joe. Good morning, everyone. I'm Deepa Iyer. I'm the Director of Professional Services here at Xagility. I started off as a web developer 19 years ago and have been into SharePoint and Office 365 for 11 plus years. Have successfully delivered over 400 SharePoint solutions, and that includes more than 250 SharePoint migrations between several versions of it. I'm also a Microsoft certified professional, and I'm very happy to be talking to you all today about some of your options to move away from 2010.
Thank you, Deepa. I appreciate that. So this morning, we're gonna, as I mentioned, we're gonna get started with a couple of polling questions for everybody. And if you could, let's go ahead and open the first polling question. Okay, so the polling question is about the version of SharePoint that your organization is currently running. And there's a couple of options here. Obviously, this covers the majority of what people have, but recently I've spoken to clients who actually have 2007 as well, which has long since been abandoned by Microsoft, but hopefully the majority of you are at least on one of these versions. And so maybe we can close this polling question, and Diane, maybe you can read the results for us.
Sure. So it looks like the majority of people, actually, I can't see the results. The majority of the people are on SharePoint Online right now, followed by SharePoint 2016, and closely together 2010 and 2013. And so it looks like everyone here is actually running some type of SharePoint.
Great. So most people are on a supported version. The big question becomes, how do you get to the next version, or one that's modern? Let's go to our next polling question. And is your organization planning a SharePoint upgrade or migration in the near future? And if so, kind of which version are you planning on going to? We have a lot of clients who come to us with aspirations of upgrade from 2010 to 2013, and we frequently have to remind them that if they do that, they're likely to have to be planning their migration as soon as they finish going to 2013. And so focusing on the more modern versions is what we usually recommend. And so we'll leave this open for another few seconds, and then if Diane, if you can read the results to us, that'd be great.
It looks like most people are planning a migration to SharePoint Online. 22 haven't decided, which is a great reason for attending the webinar. And then there's a tie between planning to go to the server and the hybrid server. And also a number of people who are moving away from SharePoint to utilize Microsoft Teams and OneDrive for Business instead.
Interesting. A good mix across the gamut here. And well, luckily today we're gonna cover all of this, and we're gonna talk a lot about the different paths to get there. We're gonna talk about things you need to consider as you begin to plan for your migration, and we're gonna give you some very prescriptive guidance as it relates to what you need to do during your migration process. But first, the big question is why should you upgrade? And if you're on 2010, the big reason is October 13th, 2020 is coming. It's coming fast, and migrations can, in some cases, if they're done correctly under best practice format, they can take a little bit of time. And so you want to make sure you give yourself plenty of time. You don't rush it, and so starting to plan now and getting ready for that end of life date there, end of support date, is really critical. Everyone probably knows that it's actually in extended support right now. So this is even different than being in a supported version. It's just more limited. But after that October date comes, Microsoft is no longer going to provide any technical support for any issues on that platform. There'll be no bug fixes or security vulnerabilities fixed on that platform. And in some cases, if time zones are a big issue for your user base, that could be critical too, and that could be a big issue for you. Also, you need to think about the underlying infrastructure underneath the 2010. I know only a small cross section of you are on that version, but the older server versions and SQL Server versions that were being used to support that from an infrastructure perspective are either already out of support or are very shortly going to be out of support. And so, what are your real options, right? Your options are, if you're on 2010, going to a 2013 version or 2016. But as I mentioned earlier, we typically, when we engage with clients and talk to them about this option, we very much stress the fact that they're going to need to be planning their next migration very shortly after completing a migration to 2013 or even 2016. And so we are, recommending that organizations move towards the best option here, which is typically a 2019 or online on Office 365. There are certainly other options here, hybrid, and Deepa will cover some of those and what the advantages or reasons why you might want to go to a hybrid mode would be. And so, this explains some of the paths that you can take to get to your desired platform. If you're going to stay on premise, you need to maybe consider going to 2019, keep in mind the traditional sort of best practice method is going to be a serial migration path. So going from 2010 to 2013 to 2016 and then to 2019. However, there are ways to sort of skip versions, if you will, with some of the products that are available on the market today from a migration tool perspective that can help, minimize that requirement. But if you're moving to the cloud, you're talking about a drastically different platform from the on-premise versions that you're used to working in. And so moving to the cloud is a major change, but there are a lot of reasons why that major change could be the best option for you. And so in order to explain these different paths and the pros and cons of them, and help you make a decision on which one to go to, I'm going to have Deepa answer your questions today, the ones I know that are top of mind for you. And so I'm going to turn this over to her.
Thank you, Joe. Hello, everyone, once again. So where should you go next? The first and the foremost is whether you have already determined to migrate, or because of the end of support, you're planning to migrate. Definitely you should have a clear picture of where do you want to go next. So at a very high level, let's look at what's involved, whether you're going to SharePoint Online or SharePoint on-prem, right? When it comes to the actual cost of moving from one version to the other, no matter the platform, it's pretty similar, right? You have to plan, you have to do the migration and execute it, and then you have to also validate and verify that you're successfully moved to the new platform. So from a cost involved in the migration perspective, lower your version, I would say higher the cost. Like for example, if you are going from 2010 to 2019 or online, you already are aware that you're in a decade-old system, right? So there is going to be a higher cost involved in planning and executing that. Some of the other things that would drive the cost is also how much customizations you have in your system. So more the customization, it calls for more planning and more execution time. So just keep that in mind, that it's going to be pretty similar no matter what your end platform is. And then when we talk about CapEx, that's where you see the true advantage of being in SharePoint Online, right? If you're determining to go to a SharePoint server on-prem, just know that there is hardware and licensing costs that's going to be higher compared to moving to online. And especially if you are already having some workloads online in Office 365, like Exchange or OneDrive or something, you're pretty much, you're not paying extra for SharePoint Online, right? You already own your licenses, and you could technically maximize your ROI by going into SharePoint Online. And then also one thing to remember is your cost of migration. We talked about the cost to do it now, but remember, once you're online, you're kind of done upgrading. You don't have to migrate again to another version. Whereas if you're doing a SharePoint 2019, most likely there are going to be other versions that are going to come out in the future, and you have to migrate again and plan for it. So remember that cost. And then, so overall, if you see your total cost of ownership from a maintenance perspective and CapEx perspective is definitely going to be higher on the SharePoint on-prem, and some of on your data center or on-prem somewhere, that's being managed by your resources. Granted, you probably have really good top-notch resources, but being in SharePoint Online, your environment or your hardware and infrastructure, and also the SharePoint software itself is going to be managed by Microsoft, who's the industry leader, and they're innovating, and so that brings you more reliability of the product. And we have seen that there has been a 99.9% uptime SLA on SharePoint Online. And if you have to match that on-prem, definitely, your cost is going to be higher, right? And then the bullet about security and compliance is one thing which I have seen it going back and forth between an advantage and a disadvantage. One thing for us to determine is that definitely being on-prem, you're going to have better controls over your security and compliance. But based on what we are seeing out of Ignite this year, which happened like 4 days ago, it started 4 days ago, is SharePoint Online has introduced a lot of functionality around data protection and information protection. One of them being their sensitivity labeling, which is going to be offered on top of SharePoint Online, where you can auto-label, you can set up rules to auto-label your documents and content inside of SharePoint Online. And based on the label, you can apply some security policies automatically, including encrypting documents. And so these are some things, if you have to do on-prem, it's going to take up a lot of setup and configuration. And one cool thing that I saw in Ignite as well is even on encrypted documents, you can seamlessly co-author your documents and things like that. So a lot of cool features, which is why I found it very compelling to put the security and compliance as an advantage of going online than a disadvantage. And then, of course, you're going to be privy to all of the latest and greatest functionalities and features, right? So if you're an organization who's cutting edge and you want to be on top of your game when it comes to innovation, definitely you should be considering online. And we talked about the auto upgrade. So you're always entitled to the latest and the greatest. So you are not upgrading anything anymore, right? Microsoft is doing it for you. And storage is a factor which a lot of people do not think about when it comes to planning, but it's a very, very important feature. Again, in Ignite, the announcement is that you can upload up to file size of 100 GB, which is tremendous, right? And your SharePoint Online site collections can hold, like one site collection can hold up to 25 terabyte of content, which is, again, if you have to support that on-prem, and if you are like a legal firm, or if you have legal requirements to hold on to documents for a long period of time, or you transact on a lot of documents, think about that aspect. You definitely get better storage and better speed with that kind of huge files being online, because Microsoft is scaling the infrastructure for you, and you don't have to worry about adding other servers and patching them and maintaining them, right? And and the other advantage is if you are an organization who interacts a lot with extranet users, and if you're right now hosting them in your Active Directory or in some sort of a SQL server, their user information, you can vouch for what amount of a nightmare it is to maintain it, password manage them, and also putting together the right security policies, making sure external users in your AD does not get to see something that they shouldn't. It's a lot of stress on IT. But with SharePoint Online and Azure B2B, which is a topic in itself, I won't go too much into detail, but just know that you can basically have your external users come in and access your SharePoint files in a secure fashion using their email addresses. So you don't have to create email addresses for them. Of course, if you would like to, you can, but there are options where they will still be placed in your Azure Active Directory, their user records, so you can manage them, but they can use their own email address is an option. And also, if they have Office 365 licenses, they can bring their own license to access your SharePoint information. So that brings and calls for better collaboration with your vendors and partners and customers.
It seems like, Deepa, that would help to drive down some of the cost of supporting that extranet as well, correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's definitely a cost factor, and better maintenance. You get functionalities like auto password management, so you do not have to ever worry about maintaining external users and their passwords. They can manage it themselves. Of course, there are some additional licenses, but it's very minuscule when you compare it to the maintenance and the security stress that you would have.
And then one other thing, just to reemphasize that higher storage capacity, advantage there. Deepa said this, but I want to make sure everyone's clear on it. You can now have 25 terabyte site collections, which is huge, major differentiator from past capacity limitations. And if you had to have that on premise, wow, you'd be spending a lot with those SAN vendors, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and all that cost, and then it's not easy to scale up and down, right? So again, preparing for growth, right? If your company is growing in the next few years, which I would, I believe you are all, definitely plan for the higher storage capacity. And when we really talk about disadvantages, right? Again, one can argue about some of these things, like the customizations. They are limiting the amount of customizations that you can do. Basically, that's because you do not have control over the servers. If I have to get a little bit technical, what you get is one web application for you, and you can spin up how many hours site collections you want. That's how much control you have. But that could be a blessing in disguise, because we have been in several systems and farms where people have customized it so much that it's really kind of making it a big nightmare to move them to the next version. And some of these customizations are not maintained at all. So unless there's a really true big business need or a driver, you shouldn't be customizing it. I mean, configurations are fine, but we have seen that when we do evaluations, 50% of the customizations are just done for real no good business reasons, right? So actually not having those capabilities, or probably you're better off not having them from a governance perspective. And then one of the, I would say personally, from working with several customers, the biggest concern is definitely the change management aspect. So just know that, sometimes on a Monday morning, you could come in and see a new function, and the users are like, what is this? And what is this? And some people like it, and some people are confused. Again, 90% of the times you can toggle it off. The new features can be toggled off. So if you have a good managed services partner, they should be ahead of the game and notifying you that, hey, something like this is gonna come. You can either script by using PowerShell, turn it off, or plan for it. So just know that that's something, keeping up with the technology, you have to also keep up with the change. So your users better. So think about what will work for your users. And we talked about the lack of control, but another sort of shortcoming, which is also, who knows, maybe in a year that may not be a true shortcoming, is interoperability with the LOB system. So if you have HR systems or finance systems, like Deltek CostPoint is one of the very common one which people have on-prem, or and they want to integrate SharePoint with it. We've seen several HR systems as well which are on-prem that people would want to pull information from. So if you're online, it's not impossible, but you have to jump through a few hoops to get those integrations in place. And staying on-prem is definitely going to help you with better integration with some of the systems you have online. But again, a lot of the software vendors are moving to SaaS platforms now, and Microsoft is only expanding their connectivity with some of these very popular ones. So the chances are, that's why I said in a year, you may already have a seamless integration worked out, right?
Well,
So this should have given you some information on what you like and do not like about SharePoint Online. So, okay, now we've talked enough about online. So let's say that I have a use case, I have to stay on-prem for whatever reason, right? My management is not ready to be in the cloud yet. My users are not yet ready to adopt to the cloud. You want to stay on-prem. That is an option too. But as Joe mentioned, remember that there are two different methods you can upgrade on-prem. one of them, which is the age-old sort of a way to do it, is upgrading your databases. So again, there are advantages and disadvantages, but now more so, I wouldn't personally recommend that method, because if you have to migrate from 2010 to 2019 by upgrading your databases, you have to basically move to every single version, like 2013, 2016, and then to 2019. Plus, any leftover dirt in your database because of a patching failure or anything like that, you're bringing it over. So our recommendation is definitely going to be use a migration tool. There are several third-party tools like which we partner with too, like Quest and ShareGate available. And one other exciting Ignite announcement is the native SharePoint migration tool now supports SharePoint 2010 as a source. So Microsoft is also invested into migrating you. So they are providing these tools natively, which can help you migrate into SharePoint, different versions of SharePoint. So that's remembering that, and then also know that what are some of the supported and unsupported upgrade paths, right? So we talked about the database approach, but the content migration approach is probably going to be a more recommended path. And also remember, the chances are you probably had like just 2 server SharePoint farm in 2010. And in 2019, the basic recommended production farm setup calls for 4 SharePoint servers and at least one SQL server. So right there, you need more hardware, and also you need to get on to the latest version of Windows Server as well as SQL. So do not look at it just as a SharePoint migration. You have to migrate your Windows operating system as well as SQL. So keep that in mind. And the biggest driver and the factor for any migration is the customizations. So just so you know, if you think my form is super customized, so if I go from 2010 to 2019, they're all going to magically work because I have control over the server, I'm afraid to say your chances of that is less than 40%, because the framework has changed. The basic development APIs have changed. So back in the days, it used to be more server model. Now people are moving across the board, not just SharePoint, right? Throughout the development model has moved into client object model. So the chances that you developed a web part and stuck the DLL into your server is not going to work in the newer environment. So plan a lot for customizations. There are newer models like SharePoint FX, SPFX, which works in both on-prem and online, and you should be sticking to that model for any of your customizations. And also think about for any workflows or form solutions, definitely you should be considering the Power Platform, which now integrates with the on-prem versions as well. So let's see what are the advantages and disadvantages of remaining on-prem, right? So obviously you have the full control, and you have full access for your customization. So you can do whatever you want to do. You can determine what your disaster recovery plan is. How do you want to interact? What do you want to secure? What servers? You can put things like only on VPN this is accessible. This is not accessible via the web, and so you have more control. And I would like to say, you can certainly have your own security policies and compliances your way. So if you want to put your database in a server in a different location for a certain application within SharePoint, you can do things like that being on-prem. And again, we talked about enterprise integration, so that's definitely easier. And if we talk about the disadvantages, of course, cost is the biggest, right? Think about hardware, think about storage, think about the CapEx, and people constantly upgrading and patching these, and disaster recovery and high availability, right? With SharePoint Online, you are getting that for free. I mentioned 99.9% uptime SLA. If you have to support that on-prem, just imagine what that takes. I mean, it's not impossible, but it's just a lot of work, and constantly testing your disaster recovery mechanisms too. So you're going to get slower access to the latest features. So if you're in a competitive situation, your competitors who are on SharePoint Online probably are utilizing more AI and cooler functionality than you are. So keeping that in mind. And so, this is kind of like similar to what Joe mentioned, but, we've talked about the on-prem and online. I want to mention that some of our customers would like to host their SharePoint servers on Azure or AWS or any other cloud infrastructure provider. That is still considered as a SharePoint on-prem, because you still have the full control and you still have to plan for backup recovery and all that. So, and there is another in-between path, which again, a lot of my customers have preferred, is the hybrid setup. So the hybrid is, again, in a hybrid, you have a hard hybrid and a soft hybrid. So what I mean by the hard is where you really have Office 365, you really have an on-prem system and they are both connected. So you can search across the board and you click a link, it seamlessly takes the person between the environments. And the end user does not really know the difference between where he or she is. The soft hybrid is where people have two environments, but they're treated separate. One classic scenario for that is how some of my customers, they have a lot of LOB, enterprise integration on-prem, so they want to keep their intranet on-prem and they want to move their extranet to SharePoint Online. So that's something you can think about too. So do not feel like you have to pick one platform. You can stay hybrid. And for some of our federal customers, they have really liked hybrid because it's like that transition path for them where they can experience the cloud and they can migrate slowly. So if you have a lot of content, it's probably better for you to do hybrid, because then you can slowly migrate and you can have both the environments and slowly you can plan your migration over years. However, of course, there is cost involved in that. So you are paying for the Office 365 licenses as well as your hardware costs. So remember that when you choose hybrid as your destination. So what methods? So what are some of the migration methods that you have? If you are an environment, you do not really have too much customization. You've been sticking to out of the box. You do not have as much content, or you have a lot of content, but it's all basic out of the box stuff. You would fall under the category of lift and shift. So which is basically, it's as is migration from one environment to the other. Right, that's the easiest and the cheapest probably of all the migrations. And then the second category is the refactor. So that's where some of you people who said, like, we need to retool, right? We've been using InfoPath. InfoPath is still supported, so there isn't a compelling reason to move out of InfoPath yet. But eventually everybody has to Power Apps or whatever your forms tool that you want to choose. And also SharePoint Designer workflows are also supported in the new platform. There are some shortcomings. I want to say that not every InfoPath form or SharePoint Designer workflow is supported. Specifically, if you had code behind on your InfoPath, that's not supported if you go online. It's still supported in 2019. So remember that. But it's time to retool. If you have a decade-old platform, and why not think about retooling? Some of the things which required customization back in the day is out of the box now. So the retooling doesn't only mean that you have to take one customization and customize it further. It could mean you change your business process a little bit and you basically tie it to one of the out of the box capabilities, and that's where the power of the new platform comes, right? And the other thing to consider during refactoring refactoring is the information architecture. So what I mean by that is, if you are stuck in a physical setup of subsites and a certain hierarchy, because that's how your departments were organized 10 years ago, but now things are moving. I see this all the time where they say, hey, we are called this, but this is where the site is, and it's not located in the correct position. So right now with SharePoint Online, last year in Ignite, Microsoft said, think hub before sub. So they're coming up with this concept of logically connecting the different sites rather than physically placing them in a hierarchy. So think about it as a model where everything is it's a flat structure, but you connect whether departments or projects to a team or whatever, using hub sites. And just know that the hub sites are not available yet in SharePoint 2019. It's a SharePoint Online only feature. But still, this is a time when you migrate, you can re-architect your structure and say that now can we club departments this way, or can we club sub-sites this way? So that would come under a refactoring option. And then the third and the most sort of extensive category is the re-architecture. Again, if you have a lot of customization, you probably need to re-strategize and rebuild some of your old solutions in the new environments. So that would fall under re-architecture. Again, any good vendor, what they must do is take a look at your solution and first see if that solution can be addressed using out-of-the-box capabilities. If not, the second option is to go into configuration only. So still using out-of-the-box, but your configuring certain updates to map it to your solution requirements. And then the third is when you absolutely have to customize it. That's when you look to like latest tools like SPFX or Microsoft Flow is now, as of 4 days ago, has been rebranded to Power Automate. So Power Automate and Power Apps. So if you would like to re-strategize and sort of develop your solutions, that would come under re-architecture method. So these are like the common methodologies to basically do a SharePoint migration.
So using stuff like Power Apps and Power Automate too would give you the capability to have it these applications be responsive on mobile devices as well, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And those are, there are apps available. I mean, no matter the platform, whether it's 2019 or online, it's definitely going to be a responsive system. So you are going to have that mobile capabilities.
Right. So then you can expand the capabilities out to just beyond the desktop, out to a bunch of different types of devices, and therefore hopefully get a lot more usage of the system.
Absolutely.
And ultimately, more usage, greater adoption means better ROI for the solution itself.
Absolutely. So let's go in and talk about what's your upgrade journey going to look like. We have a prescriptive approach of how we do migrations here, and if you have to summarize it, we categorize them under like the 6 high-level checklists or phases, sometimes you call, and they're all equally important. And let's go ahead and take a look at what we propose your journey should be, right? For any successful migration, it always starts with discovery and leads into planning. I will tell you, it is extremely critical that you plan your migration. It's critical because I help customers all the time, and one of them that I'm helping right now, they have over 2,000 site collections, and they just made a decision in July to migrate some of them to online. They did not really plan well, so the customers were not trained properly. So they said, hey, I need access to my old site because this new site is difficult for me. So they gave access to the old site. Some users kept updating the new site. Some users kept updating the old site, and now they are with this mess of nobody knows where the latest content is. So we are trying to help fix this for them and consolidate and take them to the new platform. So please, it will be time and money well spent if you plan your migrations. So Yeah, obviously. So if you see the journey, it's going to be, we do discovery, we'll plan for how your migration should be, we'll make sure you build a solid foundation destination. So there are some aspects to talk about. We'll talk in detail there when we get to that slide, and then spread the word and prepare the user. This is very important. It's whether it's just one version or several versions, it's very critical that your users are on board for your migration from the get-go, so that the transition and the change management is super easy, and the adoption as well. So there are some strategies around how you can do this, how you can involve your users, which we'll talk about here in a few. And then the step, and you have to also plan for that. So even though it's set up as a fourth step, but you have to also plan for how you're going to do the change management. And then number 5 is you execute the migration, actually perform it. Like, that's like my favorite phase, right? Where we are heads down doing the work, actual delivery work. And then check your work and make sure it's everything is good in the new environment and celebrate it, right? Those are the high level. Let's see what each phase sort of entitles you into, right? So what exactly is discovery? Many times people think, why do these companies charge us money to do a discovery? It is important. It is what's feeding into planning, right? It is important for any vendor who's performing, or even if you're doing it internally, it's important that you have a sort of inventory of what you have, right? What's your form architecture? Why was it done that way? Right? How many web applications you have, site collections, what kind of customizations you have, what kind of databases do you have? Like, have you been archiving? Have you, are your databases within the range of acceptable storage capacity? There's a 200 GB sort of guideline on your database size. So basically, first thing is you need to sit and understand, even with your end users, what are their what are their sort of wish list. Maybe they lived with the platform, but they want to do certain things differently. So understanding and discovering that is very, very important. Sometimes along with discovery, it's also a good idea to do some envisioning to show them what the new platform is going to be, what are some functionality they're going to get, so to get them excited, right? So but here's a list of things. I'm not going to read out each one of them, but these are some very common sort of items for you to discover in your environment and know what is there. Okay.
Deepa, recently I've been talking with clients who are considering upgrades and trying to figure out which is the best path to go. And we talk about discovery a lot with folks. And if you think about it, a lot of these IT folks have either recently or in the last couple of years maybe joined the organizations they work for today, and they're in charge of a SharePoint environment that could be up to 10 years old. Mm-hmm. And although they're really smart, capable people, they don't have all the knowledge of what's happened in that environment over the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. And so doing that discovery becomes ultra critical, so that you uncover all the aspects of the SharePoint environment before you make a decision about where you need to land, right, as a destination, right?
Right. And one interesting incident that I would like to quote here is during discovery for one of the associations, of financial associations, I was working with them, and we were taking a checklist of all these things, and our IT contact there started, or we met with an events management group, and they started saying, yeah, we have all our files in SharePoint, and we basically use WhatsApp to talk about the files during events, because everybody's distributed and there's a lot of coordination that needs to happen. And we discovered that, how are you even copy pasting these links or these documents and sharing and collaborating on them in WhatsApp, right? So we talked to them during the planning and visioning phase, showed them the capabilities of Teams, and they said that discovery led to a better solution for them, where they were actually migrated out of SharePoint into Teams and using Teams as that one platform. And it was a game changer for them, right? Yep. So it's important. That's why it's important to have discovery. So the next phase is planning. I mean, this is the most critical phase of any migration, I would say. And anybody who's listening, please do not ever try to step over or, or not do this phase, I would say. This is important. And this is where you will basically, whether it is a refactor or a re-architecture sort of migration, this is where you will sit and plan what's the right way to map it. This involves talking to your users, understanding their business use cases, and tying them to technology. And this is what can truly bring digital transformation for the end users. So, are you reusing content types? Many times we see that there's redundancy. How do we mitigate that? What should be, and you have to plan for your information architecture, right? How are your sites going to be structured? Are they going to be templatized so all your departments look pretty similar, so you're not left with there's so much inconsistencies and it's not usable, right? You have to think about branding. You have to think about navigation. You have to think about, are your users going to be using a mobile device, or are they only going to be from a desktop, right? A desktop browser. And cleanup, is another big aspect of when you plan your migration, and have you thought about what needs to go and what does not need to go? And what are your requirements around archival or data retention and data policies, right? The data loss policies and information protection. So those are some things that needs to be planned well in ahead. And also permissions is a big thing. We go into so many migrations, we look at the common problem that people have is, it's grown so much out of control that we don't know who has access to what. And people, most likely the people who really need to have access, they get access denied screens. So planning for permissions, it may even, we have gone into migrations where we have redone permissions for the better. And the other thing is search. A lot of people say hey, we can never seem to find things. Okay, so you need to obviously architect it a certain way. Maybe it was not done. And plus, one good news is, SharePoint search has evolved so much in the new platform. It's an AI powered search. So it's important to know that there are very cool functionalities and features in search. But you have to plan for those things, right?
What are some of the big pitfalls if you don't do planning and you just jump right into a migration? What's the biggest?
Yeah, the biggest is definitely you maybe you had a mess and you're just continuing to have the mess, but with more mess because it's a new platform, nobody knows. So let's say I'll tell you one thing. There was this one customer of mine. They had a very beautifully designed system. I mean, in fact, everything was architected so well. So they said, oh, we don't need to plan. We just need to do lift and ship, right? And guess what happened was they never really planned for change management. So now the users on a Monday morning are coming in. All they have is an email telling them that now this is your new link, and nobody knows where to go. Nobody knows how to access things, and now suddenly there's a mess. I mean, all of these things would have been caught during a planning session, right? So yeah, definitely, and permissions is also another big thing, right? That you have to plan for. Mm-hmm. So it is critical for, I wouldn't say not just SharePoint migrations, right? Any project, it's important that you plan when you're upgrading.
Right on. Okay.
All right. So the next one is building a very solid foundation. So here's where some of these bullets are very particular to on-prem, but when it comes to online, here's where you start building a structure based on your plan, your migration plan, and say that, okay, now I need to start structuring my sites or site collections in this way, right? I need to make sure I have all my services running and configured on an on-prem. And even in online, there are policies and things that you need to put together. So I don't want people to think that because I'm going online, I only have to worry about the migration. You still need to set up your SharePoint environment. You need to set up, are you going to allow external sharing? What are your policies around it? Are you going to set up metadata? Are you going to set up some sort of a branding? And so all those decisions needs to be implemented and building a solid sort of a destination foundation. And you have to think about backups, right? SharePoint Online does provide backup, but I think you will get data only as recent as 8 hours by putting in a call. But if you need more granular backups, you still have to invest in a third-party backup tool. So you have to set up all those things, configure your migration tool, right? Determine what tool you're going to use, right? That's a big decision in itself. And then and basically, you start off with your communication plan and basically setting up your destination both from a process and an environment perspective to make sure you can do a successful migration. All right, and then the fourth, we talked a lot about this bullet, but just to get a little bit more detailed, you want to first talk to your stakeholders, get their buy-in, right? If your business driver is only because you don't want to be end of support, that's fine, but you still need to get them excited about the new platform and what they're getting and what they're not, right? So explain the timing properly. You have to have a schedule and a plan so you can execute, and people in your organization, your stakeholders as well as the end users, know exactly what's coming when. And training, you have to plan for, you have to set up multiple communications, you have to give them away. So now that I've gone live and something is not working for me, what's my support mechanism? You need to communicate with your users about what is that going to be and prepare them, basically. And also create some nice energy around it. I had a customer of mine, they did a contest for naming the intranet, and that created a lot of good adoption. Like, people were excited, they were excited to see, and they kept having like brown bag sessions of some new looks of what's coming and tips and tricks, and which also helped kind of spread the word, and people were really prepared, and people had like launch parties and things like that, right? So awesome. And also, I want IT folks here especially to know that it has to be an ongoing activity, because with the newer platforms, they're going to keep getting new features. So it is important to keep reinforcing the training on your users for success, right? So the second last sort of stage in your journey is the actual execution. Here's where your SMEs, your vendors, your in-house experts will basically do the migration. And so it's important, even within this phase, there are different steps and stages that you have to take. So after you've installed and configured your migration software, your source is ready, it's cleaned up, your destination is ready, you have to perform a pilot migration. And that's when you will uncover certain things. How is my connection? How is everything working, right? And then the first pass migration. So I would totally recommend everybody to do two-stage migration. So you do migration of all your content as a first pass migration, because no matter how much we plan, only 80% practically works. So there's still that 20% which you will only uncover when you perform that first pass migration. So always remember to have that kind of a staged migration, and then set up a final migration. And mostly with the use of a tool, you do not have, it's not a full final migration, it's mostly an incremental. So the time it takes for the final migration is usually lesser than what it takes for the first pass migration. And basically the last step is review and do your UAT, make sure you're doing the cutover steps, changing the links. If you have a link of your intranet or extranet posted somewhere, make sure you're updating that, and also make sure you have a full backup, and everything is working great. Your users are onboarded, trained, and system goes live, and that's it. Just have fun and celebrate your new platform.
Excellent. And we have a little bit of Q&A, a little bit of time left for Q&A, and we're going to get the first question here. Diane, do you want to tell us what the first question is?
Sure. So we have some great questions. The first one is, how are existing SharePoint 2013 workflows migrated to the cloud versus on-prem?
So that's a great question. So if these workflows are SharePoint Designer workflows, like I mentioned, most of them should go into both 2019 or online just fine, but there are certain actions that are not supported online. So you definitely have a better chance of your workflows migrating well into 2019 than online. But that said, there are some actions which are not supported, so you have to plan for it and make sure they migrate. Try it as a first pass migration, see what works and does not, and then mitigate it, and then do a remigration.
Okay. Another question, how are lists and libraries with inherited permissions migrated to the new SharePoint version, whether it's on-prem or cloud?
Absolutely. Again, most of the migration tools. I mean, pretty much all of the migration tools will carry your permissions over. So as long as if it is on-prem, the chances are you're still connecting to the same Active Directory. If it can find the users, you can map it. For online, you have to make sure your users are synchronized to Office 365, and if they are, the migration tool will automatically map the permissions and pull that into the new environment. But again, this is a good time to think about, do you want to restructure your permission and are you happy? There are certain best practices around permissions and in SharePoint Online. And Diane will be happy to answer specific questions for this asker if they want to shoot us an email later where we can go talk about some permission best practices.
Yep, absolutely. Another question, and you touched a little bit on customization. So what is the best suggested migration path for heavy levels of custom JavaScript on SharePoint 213?
So if we're talking about online, the biggest thing is, so if you have done JavaScript customizations, most likely you have content editor web parts on the pages where you have stuck in your JavaScript files or script editors. So the content editor web parts are not supported online. You can still reuse your JavaScript code, but there are different strategies. So what we would recommend is building a SPFX web part, and which can basically plug into your JavaScript, and you can reuse a lot of the code. I mean, in all honesty, if there is a lot of JavaScript code, the chances are you can reuse a lot of it and just structure it into the new sort of framework. And yeah, and there was one more thing I was going to talk about, that JavaScript customization is that also it's a time for you to upgrade into latest jQuery libraries. Something to look into. There are some open source web parts that are already available, which will take your script and plug it right in and render them. So those are some options too.
Okay, so finally, last question, and this is a good one based on your earlier discussion about the new Power Apps. So they said they're big users of the Nintex platform, forms and workflows, and the version of this tool for SharePoint Online is not as feature-rich as the server-based version. Are Power Apps and Power Automate tools replacements for third-party systems like Nintex?
Absolutely, and that's a fantastic question. So there are certain things that are not available based off of the infrastructure online, right? So what we do is we try to coexist in these scenarios. Is there are tools that would migrate your SharePoint or Nintex workflows to online, and for whatever ones where the actions are not supported, that's where we would kind of refactor them into using the Power Automate platform and Power Apps. I wouldn't say it's quite a replacement. There are benefits to both Nintex as well as Power Platform. Both of them are making updates. So I would say, let's look into the specific scenario and make a recommendation of, for this one, you do this. But but 90% of the scenarios like this, we have a coexistence of Nintex and Power Apps and Flow.
Great. I think that's it for the questions.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for your time today. We appreciate it. This webinar is recorded, and so we will have it available to you online on our website in a few days. We'll send you a link to it. So if you want to refresh your memory on any of it or go back and use it as reference generally as you're looking through your migration strategy, it'll be available to you. And so, thanks again. We appreciate it and look forward to catching you on the next webinar we'll have in the coming months.